The plane sat on the tarmac, its engines humming softly as passengers boarded through the narrow jet bridge. It was one of those typical weekday flights, a mix of business travelers, families heading off on vacation, and a few solo adventurers chasing their next big experience. Inside the cabin, people shuffled down the aisles, stowing bags, settling into seats and exchanging polite nods with strangers who would soon become temporary neighbors for the next few hours. Daniel Carter found his assigned seat near the window, in row 18. He had chosen this spot because he liked looking out at the clouds once the plane reached cruising altitude. It gave him time to think, to reflect on life without distractions. Daniel was a tall man with broad shoulders, dressed neatly in a dark blue suit that matched his calm demeanor. His polished shoes clicked softly against the floor as he slid, past other passengers already seated. He greeted them briefly with a warm smile before taking his place by the window. Across the aisle, 2 seats were occupied by a couple, Eric Dawson and his wife, Angela. Eric was in his late 50s with thinning gray hair combed carefully to one side. His face carried an air of authority, the kind that came from years of working in corporate settings, where decisions were made quickly and questions rarely asked. Angela, on the other hand, seemed quieter, more reserved. She wore a light sweater and jeans, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she glanced around the cabin. As Daniel settled into his seat, adjusting his belt and placing his small carry-on bag under the seat in front of him, Eric leaned over slightly to peer across the aisle. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly when he noticed Daniel's presence. At first, it was just a flicker of discomfort, a fleeting thought that passed through his mind, but then Eric muttered something under his breath. It wasn't loud enough for most people to hear, but Angela caught it. "What did you say?" she whispered, turning toward him. "Nothing," Eric replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just, never mind." But Eric couldn't let it go. As the minutes ticked by and more passengers filled the surrounding seats, his agitation grew. When Daniel stood up momentarily to help an elderly woman struggling to lift her heavy bag into the overhead compartment, Eric's irritation boiled over. He watched Daniel move gracefully, offering assistance with genuine kindness, and yet all Eric could focus on was the color of Daniel's skin. In his mind, biases long buried began to surface unchecked and unchallenged. Finally, Eric couldn't contain himself any longer. Leaning forward, he raised his voice just enough to draw attention. "Excuse me," he called out sharply, addressing the nearest flight attendant, a young woman named Rachel Meyer. Her name tag gleamed faintly under the cabin lights as she turned to face him, her expression neutral but alert. "Yes, sir, can I help you?" Rachel asked, approaching with practiced professionalism. She balanced a clipboard in one hand while keeping her gaze steady on Eric. "This isn't acceptable," Eric declared, pointing vaguely in Daniel's direction. "I don't feel comfortable sitting next to someone like that." His words hung awkwardly in the air, dripping with insinuation. Rachel blinked, taken aback by the bluntness of the comment. "Sir, I'm sorry if there's been some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Eric interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "I simply don't want to sit beside him. Can you find him another seat?" By now, several nearby passengers had begun to notice the commotion. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to listen, while others stared openly, curious about what would happen next. Angela sank lower in her chair, clearly embarrassed by her husband's behavior. She tugged gently at his sleeve, whispering, "Eric, please. Let's not make a scene." But Eric ignored her, too focused on making his point. "It's not personal," he added, though the irony was lost on everyone else. "I just prefer not to have certain types of people so close to me." Daniel, who had returned to his seat after helping the elderly woman, remained perfectly still. His posture was relaxed, his hands resting lightly on his thighs, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of disappointment. He didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to observe the situation unfold. He knew exactly what Eric meant by certain types of people. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered such attitudes, nor would it be the last. But today felt different somehow, more public, more raw. When Rachel hesitated, unsure how to handle the request, Daniel decided to intervene. Raising a hand slightly, he signaled for her attention. "It's okay," he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough weight to command respect. "Let me address this." Turning to Eric, Daniel leaned forward slightly, meeting the man's gaze directly. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate outward. "Sir," he began, his tone measured and polite. "You mentioned feeling uncomfortable sitting next to me. Could you clarify why that is?" For a moment, Eric faltered. He hadn't expected Daniel to engage him directly, especially not with such composure. Flustered, he stammered, "Well, it's just, I mean—" "You can speak freely," Daniel encouraged, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. "We're all adults here." The tension in the cabin grew palpable. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even Rachel, the flight attendant, stepped back slightly, giving Daniel space to take control of the conversation. Finally, Eric managed to blurt out, "Look, I don't have anything against you personally, but I'd rather not sit next to someone who might make others uncomfortable." "And who exactly do you think I might make uncomfortable?" Daniel asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of challenge. "Because, based on your earlier comments, it seems like the real issue lies with how you perceive me." Before Eric could respond, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. From it, he extracted a badge attached to a chain, the unmistakable emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Holding it up for Eric to see, he introduced himself formally. "My name is Daniel Carter, and I'm a senior agent with the FBI. Now, given my position, I think it's worth asking, are you sure you want to continue down this path?" The effect was immediate. Eric's face drained of color as realization dawned on him. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, unable to form coherent words. Around them, passengers gasped audibly, some leaning forward in disbelief. Angela gripped Eric's arm tightly, her knuckles white, whispering urgently, "What have you done?" Daniel lowered the badge slowly, slipping it back into his pocket. His expression softened slightly, though his gaze remained firm. "If you'd like, we can discuss your concerns further after landing, perhaps over coffee, or maybe in front of a judge. For now, though, let's focus on getting everyone safely to our destination. Does that sound reasonable?" Eric nodded weakly too, stunned to argue. The confrontation ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease throughout the cabin. Passengers resumed their conversations in hushed tones, many casting admiring glances at Daniel while shooting disapproving looks at Eric. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Daniel returned to his seat, closing his eyes briefly to collect his thoughts. He knew the day was far from over, and neither was the fight against ignorance. But for now, he allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction. Sometimes even the simplest acts of courage could spark change. The silence that followed Daniel Carter's revelation was deafening. Passengers who had been quietly observing the confrontation now found themselves caught between shock and admiration. Eric Dawson, still frozen in his seat, looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. His mouth hung open slightly, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrest. Angela, his wife, leaned back against her seat, her face buried in her hands. She seemed to shrink into herself, clearly wishing she could disappear entirely. Daniel, on the other hand, remained perfectly composed. He slipped the badge back into his pocket and sat up straight, his expression calm but firm. For a moment, he studied Eric carefully, noting the way the man's confidence had crumbled under the weight of reality. It wasn't anger that drove Daniel. It was a quiet determination to stand up for himself and others who might not have the same opportunity. To do so, Rachel Meyer, the flight attendant, hovered nearby, unsure how to proceed. Her training hadn't prepared her for situations quite like this one. She glanced at Daniel, then at Eric, searching for some kind of guidance. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, thank you." Daniel replied politely, offering her a reassuring nod. I believe we've resolved the matter for now, at least. His words carried an unspoken promise. The conversation wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. But for the time being, Daniel chose to let things settle. There was no need to escalate further, especially when Eric already looked like a man who had been backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. As the plane taxied down the runway, preparing for takeoff, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically. What had started as a routine flight was now anything but ordinary. Passengers began exchanging glances, their curiosity piqued by what they had just witnessed. Some leaned closer to their neighbors, whispering about the incident in hushed tones. Others simply stared at Daniel, their expressions ranging from awe to disbelief. One young woman, sitting a few rows behind Daniel, couldn't resist speaking up. Her name was Mia Torres, and she had been watching the entire scene unfold with growing frustration. Now, as the plane picked up speed, she decided it was time to say something. Leaning forward slightly, she tapped Daniel gently on the shoulder. "Excuse me," Mia said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "I just wanted to say thank you for handling that the way you did. People shouldn't treat each other like that." Daniel turned to look at her, surprised but touched by her words. "Thank you for saying that," he replied with a small smile. "It means a lot. Unfortunately, these kinds of situations happen more often than they should." Mia nodded, her dark eyes reflecting a mix of sadness and determination. "I know. It's frustrating, but seeing someone handle it with such grace, it gives me hope, you know." Daniel appreciated her sentiment, though he knew better than to dwell too much on moments like this. He offered her another polite nod before turning his attention back to the window. Outside, the ground blurred past as the plane lifted off the runway, climbing steadily into the sky. The clouds stretched out endlessly, forming a vast expanse of white that seemed almost surreal. For a brief moment, Daniel allowed himself to get lost in the view, letting the peacefulness wash over him. Back across the aisle, Eric struggled to regain his composure. Every time he glanced at Daniel, he felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him. His earlier bravado had vanished completely, replaced by a deep sense of regret. Angela, sensing his discomfort, tried once again to intervene. "Eric," she whispered, urgently leaning closer to him. "You need to apologize, right now, before things get worse." "I can't," Eric muttered, shaking his head. "Not after everything he said, not after showing that badge." "But you have to," Angela insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you realize what could happen if this gets reported? If people find out about this?" Eric swallowed. Hard, his throat dry. He knew she was right. The stakes were higher than he had anticipated, and the consequences of his actions were starting to sink in. But apologizing felt impossible. Humiliating, even. How could he face Daniel after behaving so recklessly? As the plane reached cruising altitude, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that it was safe to move about the cabin. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, retrieving books, tablets, or snacks from their bags. The initial tension began to ease, though the memory of the confrontation lingered heavily in the air. Daniel pulled out his laptop and opened it on the tray table in front of him. He needed to focus on something productive, something that would take his mind off the events of the past hour. Logging into his work email, he scrolled through a series of messages related to an ongoing investigation. As a senior FBI agent, his job often required him to juggle multiple cases at once, and today was no exception. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight had taken an unexpected turn, one that might stay with him for a long time. Meanwhile, Eric fidgeted nervously in his seat, unable to concentrate on anything else. He kept stealing glances at Daniel, hoping for some sign of forgiveness or at least understanding. But Daniel remained focused on his work, his fingers moving steadily across the keyboard as he typed out responses to his colleagues. Occasionally, he paused to review documents or jot down notes, his professionalism shining through despite the circumstances. Angela, sensing her husband's growing anxiety, tried to distract him by engaging in small talk. "Did you remember to pack your toothbrush?" she asked lightly, attempting to sound casual. "What?" Eric snapped, turning to glare at her. "Of course I packed my toothbrush. Why are you asking me this now?" "I'm just trying to help," Angela replied, her voice tinged with frustration. "You're acting like you're about to jump out of your skin." "Well, maybe I am." Eric shot back, lowering his voice when a nearby passenger glanced over. "This whole thing is a disaster, and it's all because I opened my big mouth." Angela sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing further. Instead, she reached for the in-flight magazine tucked into the seat pocket in front of her and flipped through its pages absent-mindedly. Neither of them spoke for the next several minutes, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Throughout the cabin, other passengers continued to react to the incident in their own ways. Some expressed outrage, sharing stories of similar experiences they or their loved ones had faced. Others voiced admiration for Daniel, praising his poise and professionalism. A few even approached him directly, thanking him for standing up to Eric's behavior. Each interaction reinforced the importance of speaking out against prejudice, no matter how uncomfortable it might feel. For Daniel, these moments served as a reminder of why he did what he did, not just as an FBI agent, but as a human being. While he didn't seek recognition or praise, he understood the impact that courage could have on those around him. By choosing to confront Eric calmly and confidently, he had sent a powerful message, one that resonated far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. As the flight continued, the initial drama began to fade into the background. Passengers returned to their routines, chatting with friends, reading books, or watching movies on their screens. Yet the memory of Daniel's actions lingered, etched into the minds of everyone who had witnessed them. For many, it was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget, a testament to the power of standing up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. And for Daniel, it was simply another chapter in a life dedicated to justice and equality. Though the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, he knew that every step mattered. Every act of bravery, no matter how small, brought the world one step closer to the change it so desperately needed. As the flight continued, the initial shock of the confrontation began to fade, but its effects lingered like ripples in a pond. Passengers settled back into their routines, yet the atmosphere remained subtly charged. Some people whispered behind, cupped hands, while others exchanged knowing glances. The memory of Eric Dawson's outburst and Daniel Carter's calm response hung over the cabin like an invisible cloud. Daniel had returned to his work, his laptop open on the tray table, as he reviewed case files and sent emails to colleagues. Despite the distractions around him, he maintained his focus, his fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. Every so often he glanced up at the screen, deep in thought, before jotting down notes in a small leather-bound notebook beside him. To anyone watching, he appeared completely unperturbed, as though nothing unusual had happened. But inside, Daniel was reflecting on the day's events, considering how moments like these shaped not only individual lives but society as a whole. Across the aisle, Eric Dawson couldn't shake the weight of his shame. He shifted uncomfortably, in his seat, his eyes darting nervously toward Daniel every few minutes. Each time their gazes nearly met, Eric quickly looked away, unable to face the man whose poise had exposed his own prejudice. Angela, his wife, remained silent, staring blankly out the window as if hoping the vast expanse of blue sky would swallow her guilt. She occasionally reached for her water bottle, sipping it slowly to mask her unease. Passengers nearby had begun, sharing stories among themselves, their voices low but earnest. One older woman leaned over to her companion and recounted how she once witnessed a similar incident at a grocery store. "It's always the same," she said, shaking her head. "People think they can say whatever they want because of someone's skin color. It breaks my heart." Her companion nodded solemnly. "But did you see how that man handled it? So calm, so professional. That's what we need more of. People standing up without losing their cool." These conversations rippled through the cabin, creating a sense of solidarity among many travelers. Several passengers approached Daniel discreetly to express their gratitude. A young father traveling with his teenage daughter stopped by Daniel's row, after grabbing a blanket from the overhead compartment. "Sir?" the man said softly, extending a hand. "I just wanted to thank you for setting an example today. My daughter and we really appreciate seeing someone handle things the way you did." Daniel accepted the handshake warmly, offering a polite smile. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "It's important that we all stand up against behavior like that. Not just for ourselves, but for future generations." The young girl smiled shyly, clutching her father's arm. "You were awesome," she added, her voice barely audible. Daniel chuckled lightly, touched by her sincerity. As the hours passed, turbulence rocked the plane unexpectedly, jolting everyone awake. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered on, accompanied by the captain's voice over the intercom advising passengers to return to their seats. Outside, dark clouds loomed ominously, signaling the approach of a storm. The sudden bumps and shakes caused panic among some travelers. A child cried loudly in the back and several people gripped their armrests tightly. Amid the chaos, a call came over the intercom requesting assistance from anyone with medical training. A passenger near the rear of the plane had collapsed and the onboard medic needed help stabilizing them. Without hesitation, Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt and made his way down the aisle, weaving carefully between rows as the plane shuddered beneath him. Passengers watched anxiously, whispering questions about what was happening. When Daniel arrived at the scene, he introduced himself immediately, showing his FBI badge to reassure those gathered. "My name is Daniel Carter," he announced clearly. "I'm trained in first aid. Let me know how I can assist." Working alongside the medic, he helped check the unconscious passengers' vitals and ensure they were stable until further help could arrive. His actions earned even more respect from fellow travelers. Mia Torres, the young woman who had earlier thanked Daniel, observed the scene from her seat. She marveled at his ability to remain calm under pressure, noting how effortlessly he took charge when needed. Once the situation was under control, Daniel returned to his seat, nodding briefly at passengers who offered words of appreciation along the way. Back in his row, Daniel resumed his work, though his mind kept drifting back to Eric. The man's earlier behavior troubled him, not because of personal offense, but because it highlighted the broader issue of systemic racism still embedded in society. No matter how far humanity seemed to progress, there were always reminders of the work left to be done. Eric, meanwhile, struggled to find any semblance of peace. The turbulence only heightened his anxiety, making it harder to ignore the growing pit in his stomach. When the plane finally steadied, he mustered the courage to speak again, his voice barely above a whisper. Turning slightly toward Daniel, he muttered, "Look, I didn't mean—" Daniel raised a hand gently, cutting him off. "It's okay," he said evenly. "We don't need to talk about it right now. Just focus on getting through the rest of the flight." Though brief, the exchange left Eric feeling a mix of relief and lingering discomfort. Angela noticed her husband's attempt at an apology and gave him a small, approving nod. Still, neither of them dared to engage further, knowing the damage had already been done. As the plane approached its destination, the mood shifted once more. Passengers began preparing to disembark, gathering their belongings and straightening their clothes. Many glanced at Daniel one last time, offering smiles or nods of acknowledgement. He responded graciously, aware that the day's events had left an indelible mark on everyone present. For Daniel, the flight served as both a reminder and a motivator. While incidents like this reinforced the challenges faced by marginalized communities, they also underscored the importance of resilience and advocacy. By choosing to confront prejudice head-on, with dignity and grace, he hoped to inspire others to do the same. As the wheels of the plane touched down on the tarmac in Miami, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Passengers clapped, politely, grateful for a safe landing despite the turbulence. But for Daniel, the journey wasn't truly over. It never was. There would always be another fight to pick, another injustice to address. And he was ready, because standing up for what was right wasn't just part of his job, it was part of who he was. As the plane taxied to its gate and came to a stop, the familiar hum of engines began to wind down. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, stretching stiff limbs and gathering their belongings in preparation to disembark. For Daniel Carter, this was just another routine part of traveling, but today felt different. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him as he stood up, adjusting his suit jacket and slipping his laptop back into his bag. The aisle filled quickly as people queued to leave the plane. Some passengers paused briefly to thank Daniel again before continuing forward, while others simply nodded or offered small smiles. It was clear that the events of the flight had left an impression on nearly everyone aboard. As Daniel made his way toward the exit, he noticed Eric Dawson hesitating in his seat, clearly dreading what might come next. Angela sat beside him, her face pale and drawn, clutching her purse tightly. When Daniel reached the jet bridge, he stepped aside momentarily to let others pass ahead of him. He didn't want to draw any more attention than necessary, but it seemed impossible to avoid. Passengers whispered among themselves as they filed past, some casting admiring glances at Daniel while shooting disapproving looks at Eric. A few even muttered under their breath about how some people never learn. Back in the cabin, Eric remained frozen in his seat, staring blankly at the floor. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of dread. Angela nudged him gently, urging him to stand. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just keep your head down and don't say anything." Reluctantly, Eric rose from his seat, grabbing his carry-on bag with shaky hands. Together, they joined the line of passengers exiting the plane, trailing far behind the rest. By the time they reached the jet bridge, most of the crowd had already dispersed into the terminal. But waiting for them near the entrance were two airport security officers, a man and a woman, both dressed in crisp uniforms and wearing serious expressions. One of the officers stepped forward, addressing Eric directly. "Sir, we've received reports regarding an incident during the flight. Could you please come with us to discuss the matter further?" Eric froze, his face turning ashen. He glanced nervously at Angela, who looked equally panicked. "What kind of reports?" he stammered, trying and failing to sound nonchalant. "We'll explain everything once we're in a private area," the officer replied firmly. "Please, follow us." Angela tugged at Eric's sleeve, pleading with him silently not to resist. Reluctantly, he complied, following the officers down the jet bridge with slow, heavy steps. Angela trailed closely behind, her eyes darting around anxiously as curious onlookers stopped to watch the unfolding scene. Some passengers recognized Eric as the man who had caused trouble earlier and shook their heads in disapproval. Others whispered angrily to one another, their voices carrying faintly over the hum of the terminal. Daniel, meanwhile, had already entered the terminal and was making his way toward the baggage claim area. Despite the chaos surrounding Eric's removal, Daniel maintained his composure, moving with quiet confidence. As he passed through the crowded concourse, he caught sight of Mia Torres standing near a coffee kiosk. She waved at him, smiling warmly, and Daniel returned the gesture with a polite nod. Mia approached him, her enthusiasm evident. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks again," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You handled everything so well back there. It meant a lot to see someone stand up like that." Daniel smiled softly, appreciating her words. "Thank you for saying that. It's always good to know when you're making a positive impact, even if it's just on one person." Mia nodded earnestly. "Well, you definitely made an impact on me and probably everyone else on that flight. People need to see examples like yours. Maybe then things will start to change." For a moment, Daniel considered responding, but instead he simply offered her a grateful smile. "Take care," he said before continuing toward the escalators, leading to baggage claim. Downstairs, the baggage carousel spun slowly, spitting out suitcases onto the conveyor belt. Daniel found a spot near the edge of the crowd, scanning the luggage as it emerged. While he waited, he reflected on the day's events, the confrontation, the turbulence, and the eventual resolution. Each moment had reinforced his belief in the importance of standing firm against prejudice, no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient it might be. Nearby, other passengers from the flight gathered, chatting animatedly about the drama that had unfolded. One older gentleman leaning on a cane caught Daniel's eye and gave him a respectful salute. "Good job up there, son," he said gruffly, his tone warm despite its roughness. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "Thank you, sir," Daniel replied, touched by the gesture. "It means a lot." As his suitcase finally appeared on the carousel, Daniel grabbed it and headed toward the exit. Outside, the Miami air was warm and humid, a stark contrast to the cool interior of the terminal. He flagged down a taxi and loaded his bag into the trunk, sliding into the back seat with a quiet sigh of relief. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, asking cheerfully, "Where to, boss?" "Aventura, please," Daniel replied, settling back against the seat. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. Today had been challenging, but also meaningful. Every act of courage, no matter how small, contributed to a larger movement toward equality and justice. And while the fight was far from over, moments like these reminded him why it was worth it. Meanwhile, back inside the terminal, Eric and Angela sat in a small meeting room with the airport security officers. The atmosphere was tense, with questions flying rapidly as the officers took notes and reviewed statements from witnesses on the flight. Eric shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by fear and regret. Angela sat beside him, wringing her hands anxiously, occasionally whispering reassurances that everything would be okay, even though neither of them truly believed it. By the time the questioning ended, Eric's fate remained uncertain. The officers informed him that formal complaints would likely be filed, and legal action might follow depending on the outcome of the investigation. For now, all they could do was wait. As Eric and Angela exited the meeting room, they were met with stares from passers-by, many of whom recognized them from the flight. Some shook their heads in disgust, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Walking through the terminal felt like navigating a gauntlet of judgment. Eric kept his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Angela walked beside him, her arm linked through his, offering silent support. They retrieved their checked luggage and stepped outside, where a car service awaited them. The driver held the door open wordlessly, his expression unreadable. As the car pulled away from the curb, Eric stared out the window, watching the city blur past. He thought about the choices he had made during the flight and the consequences they had brought. Angela reached over and placed a hand on his knee, squeezing gently. "We'll figure this out," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. For Daniel, however, the day marked a step forward, not just for himself, but for those who sought to challenge injustice wherever it arose. Though the road ahead would undoubtedly be long and difficult, he knew that every effort counted, and as the taxi carried him toward his destination, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The taxi ride to Aventura gave Daniel Carter time to decompress after the long day. As he gazed out the window, watching the Miami skyline give way to quieter streets lined with palm trees, he felt a mix of emotions: pride in how he had handled himself, frustration over the prejudice he'd encountered, and determination to keep fighting for change. When the car finally pulled up outside a small cafe nestled on a corner lot, Daniel stepped out, paid the driver, and took a deep breath of the humid evening air. Inside the cafe, Laura Bennett was already waiting for him. She sat at a table, near the window, her laptop open but pushed slightly aside as she scrolled through her phone. Laura was also an FBI agent, though her role often involved more behind-the-scenes work than field operations. Still, she shared Daniel's passion for justice and equality, making her one of his closest confidants both personally and professionally. "Hey," Daniel said, approaching the table with a tired smile. "Sorry I'm late." Laura looked up and waved off his apology. "Don't worry about it. I figured you'd have a story or two to tell after that flight." Her tone was light, but her eyes betrayed concern. Daniel chuckled softly as he slid into the seat across from her. "You could say that." A waitress appeared moments later, refilling Laura's coffee cup and offering Daniel a menu. He ordered a cappuccino and leaned back in his chair, letting the cozy ambiance of the cafe settle around him. Outside, the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Palm fronds swayed gently in the breeze, casting playful shadows on the pavement. "So?" Laura began once the waitress had left. "What happened? You look like you've been through the ringer." Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples briefly. Before launching into the story, he recounted every detail: the initial confrontation with Eric Dawson, the revelation of his identity as an FBI agent, the turbulence and medical emergency, and finally, Eric's removal from the plane by airport security. Laura listened intently, her expression shifting between anger, disbelief, and admiration. "That guy sounds like a real piece of work," Laura said when Daniel finished. "But honestly, I'm not surprised. People like him don't realize how much damage they cause until they're forced to face the consequences." "I know," Daniel replied, nodding slowly. "And even then, it's hard to say if anything will really change for him. Some people might learn from this experience, but others, they'll just double down on their biases." Laura frowned thoughtfully, tapping her fingers lightly on the edge of her coffee mug. "Still, what you did today matters. Standing up to someone like that, it sends a message. Not just to him, but to everyone else who witnessed it. Sometimes, moments like these can inspire people to speak up when they see injustice." Daniel nodded, appreciating her perspective. "I hope so. But it's exhausting, you know? Dealing with stuff like this shouldn't still be necessary in 2023. Yet here we are." The waitress returned with Daniel's cappuccino, setting it down, with a polite smile before disappearing again. Daniel took a sip, savoring the rich flavor as he gathered his thoughts. "It's not just about me, though," he continued after a pause. "It's about all the people who don't get the chance to stand up for themselves, or who feel like they can't because of the risks involved. If sharing my story helps even one person find the courage to push back against discrimination, then it's worth it." Laura smiled warmly, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "That's why you're so good at what you do, Daniel. You don't just think about the immediate impact, you consider the bigger picture. And trust me, your actions ripple farther than you realize." Their conversation shifted to lighter topics as they enjoyed their drinks and watched the world go by outside the window. They talked about ongoing cases, upcoming vacations, and funny anecdotes from their time working together. For a while, Daniel allowed himself to relax, grateful for the company of someone who understood the challenges he faced without needing to spell them out. As the evening wore on, Daniel brought up something that had been weighing on his mind. "Do you ever feel like we're fighting a losing battle?" he asked quietly. "Like no matter how hard we try, there's always another incident, another setback?" Laura tilted her head, considering the question. "Sometimes, yeah. It's easy to feel overwhelmed when you focus too much on the negatives. But then I remind myself of all the progress we've made, and all the people out there who are doing incredible work to create change. We may not fix everything overnight, but every step forward counts." Her words resonated deeply with Daniel. He knew she was right. The fight for equality was a marathon, not a sprint. There would be days filled with frustration and setbacks, but there would also be victories, big and small, that made the effort worthwhile. By the time they left the cafe, the sun had fully set, leaving the city bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Daniel and Laura walked to their respective cars, exchanging final pleasantries before parting ways. As Daniel drove home, he reflected on the conversation, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, the road ahead would be difficult, but he wasn't alone. Together, with allies like Laura and countless others, they could continue pushing for a better future. Back at his apartment, Daniel poured himself a glass of water and settled onto the couch, flipping through emails on his phone. One message caught his eye, a note from Mia Torres, the young woman who had thanked him on the plane. She had sent him a short message expressing gratitude once again and attaching a link to an article about combating racism in everyday life. Daniel smiled, touched by her thoughtfulness. He replied briefly, thanking her for reaching out and encouraging her to keep speaking up whenever she saw injustice. After sending the email, he leaned back against the cushions, closing his eyes for a moment. Today had been challenging, but it had also reminded him why he chose this path, to make a difference no matter how daunting the task might seem. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to stand up for what was right. And Daniel was ready. Because every act of courage mattered, and together those acts could spark meaningful change. The next morning, Daniel Carter woke up feeling refreshed but thoughtful. He had spent much of the previous evening reflecting on the events of the flight, the confrontation with Eric Dawson, the support he received from passengers like Mia, Torres, and the conversation with Laura Bennett at the cafe. Each moment had reinforced his belief that standing up against prejudice was not just important, it was essential. As he prepared for the day ahead, Daniel reminded himself that every challenge presented an opportunity to inspire others and drive meaningful change. After finishing breakfast, Daniel headed to the office. His workplace was located in downtown Miami, a bustling area filled with towering skyscrapers and busy streets. Inside the FBI building, the environment was professional yet welcoming. Colleagues greeted him warmly as he made his way to his desk, where stacks of case files awaited his attention. Despite the demands of his job, Daniel approached each task with focus and determination, knowing that his work contributed to something greater than himself. Later that afternoon, Daniel attended a team meeting to discuss ongoing investigations. Around the conference table sat men and women from diverse backgrounds, all united by their commitment to justice. As they reviewed recent developments, Daniel shared insights from his own experiences, emphasizing the importance of addressing systemic issues within society. His colleagues listened intently, nodding in agreement as he spoke about using their platform to advocate for equality and fairness. "You know," one of his co-workers, Marcus Hill, said during a break in the discussion, "what happened on your flight yesterday? It's a reminder of why we do what we do. It's not just about solving crimes or catching bad guys. It's about protecting people and giving them hope." Daniel smiled appreciatively. "Exactly. Every case we handle, every person we help, it sends a message. And sometimes, even small actions can spark big changes." The meeting concluded. With renewed energy among the team members, they returned to their desks, ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. For Daniel, the rest of the day passed quickly as he worked through reports, coordinated with other agents, and responded to emails. By evening, he felt satisfied with what he had accomplished, though he knew there was still more to be done. That night, Daniel decided to take a walk through the city. The air was cool, carrying the scent of salt water from nearby Biscayne Bay. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the distant hum of traffic provided a soothing backdrop. As he strolled along the sidewalk, Daniel allowed himself to think about the bigger picture, the countless individuals around the world who face discrimination daily, often without a voice to defend them. He thought about Eric Dawson and wondered whether the man would truly learn from his mistakes. Would he recognize the harm caused by his words and actions? Or would he retreat further into denial, blaming others for his discomfort? While Daniel couldn't predict the future, he hoped that the incident on the plane might serve as a turning point, not just for Eric but for anyone who witnessed it. As he walked, Daniel also reflected on the positive reactions he had received from fellow passengers, people like Mia Torres, the older gentleman at baggage claim, and even strangers who simply nodded in approval had reminded him of the power of solidarity. Their gratitude reinforced his belief that speaking out against injustice wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about creating a ripple effect that inspired others to act. Eventually, Daniel found himself near a park overlooking the bay. He paused for a moment, taking in the serene beauty of the scene before him. Waves lapped gently against the shore, and boats bobbed lazily in the distance. In that moment, Daniel felt a deep sense of clarity. The fight against racism and prejudice was far from over, but progress was possible, one courageous act at a time. On his way home, Daniel stopped by a convenience store to grab a bottle of water. As he waited in line to pay, he noticed a young boy staring at him curiously. The child tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered something too softly for Daniel to hear. The woman smiled kindly and leaned down to speak to her son. "That man over there?" she said, pointing discreetly toward Daniel. "He helps keep people safe. Maybe someday you'll want to do something brave like that too." Daniel overheard the comment and couldn't help but smile. It was a small interaction, but it carried significant meaning. Children learned by example, and if his actions could inspire even one young person to stand up for what was right, then his efforts were worthwhile. Back at his apartment, Daniel settled onto the couch with a cup of tea, flipping through a book he had been reading. It was a collection of essays about resilience and perseverance, written by authors from marginalized communities. Each story resonated with him, offering both comfort and motivation. He realized that while the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, he wasn't alone. There were countless individuals, past, present, and future, fighting alongside him for a better world. Before going to bed, Daniel checked his phone one last time. Another email from Mia Torres had arrived, this time sharing a photo of a community event she had attended focused on racial equality. She wrote that Daniel's actions on the plane had inspired her to get involved, and she thanked him once again for being a role model. Daniel replied with heartfelt gratitude, encouraging her to continue making a difference in her own way. After sending the email, he turned off his phone and climbed into bed, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. Today had been a reminder of both the challenges and rewards of standing up for justice. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to lead by example, to listen, and to act. And Daniel was ready, because every step forward mattered, no matter how small. Together, those steps could pave the way for lasting change.